In today's video, we're going to continue with the Gospel of John, starting in chapter 2. Now, in this chapter, we look at Jesus' first miracle. In the previous videos, we discussed the deity of Jesus, who is he, and how did he start accruing some of his disciples, and then who is John the Baptist. And if you want to check those out, please go check out a link to our other video. If you're interested and you want to start at the beginning of this study, you can check out John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and I'll leave that link right here. And let's just go ahead and get started. So we are in John chapter 2, and I'm going to start in verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now, let's just unpack this really quick, because one of the first things that we see in here is when Mary asks Jesus, "Hey, can you help us out? We're out of wine." Number one, we see that Mary knows that Jesus is the Christ. Mary knows that he can do miracles. Mary knows that he can take care of all of their issues. But when she does this, Jesus responds to her as woman. Now, don't think of that as a misogynistic woman, get back in where you're supposed to be. That's not what that is. It's a term of endearment. So when you actually see in the Old Testament, you see Adam and Eve, right? And at the beginning, it's really Adam and woman. And now some people say, well, why does Adam get a name, but she doesn't? And she gets the name after the fall of man in chapter 3, and he says, "You will be called Eve." Well, the funny thing is, Adam actually didn't get a name at all, whereas Eve did, because Adam is just Hebrew for man, and woman was, well, woman or wife or female, the other half of our species. So calling her woman wasn't like this misogynistic thing to say, okay? So let's just get that out of the way. Now, also understand something. Mary has all the honor that is due to her. She is not to be praised. She's not to be worshipped. She is a vessel. There are some Christian religions that believe that we should pray to Mary, but there's really nowhere in the Bible that says that we should. Now, continuing on to Jesus' response, he says, "My time has not yet come." And there's a lot of times where Jesus actually says this. He says, my hour has not yet come. And this is actually the first miracle that is recorded in the Gospels, as far as a timeline goes, because John was written after the other Gospels. But as far as timeline goes, this is the first miracle that we know of that Jesus performed. God has an appointed time for everything and for everyone. And there may be some times that we don't, God, you need to fix this now. Lord, please help me with my pain or with my sickness, or help me with this test or whatever. Well, sometimes it's just not the right time, and God knows better than we do. And we may think it would be better if it happened now, whatever I want to happen. But God's already got a plan. God's already laid it out and knows, hey, this is actually the best timing, because this will prove your character. It will make you a better person. It will further sanctify you as a Christian. There are all sorts of things that, why do bad things happen to good people? First off, there are no good people. Every single one of us deserves hell. Every one of us is a sinner. God may allow bad things to happen so that you can further grow and further appreciate him, and maybe give you the opportunity to share about those struggles and further give glory to God. Let's continue on in verse 6. There were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." So they filled them to the brim. Now, first off, when we see in verse 6, he mentions these water pots, and he says these water pots were for Jewish purification. Essentially, this is kind of like Old Testament baptism, okay? It was a ceremonial washing that they did in the Old Testament. Now, notice the directions. Jesus says, hey, fill them up with more water. They're already filled, but I want you to fill them to the top. The brim is the very top, means if you add any more, it will spill over. Now, why would he say something like this? They already had plenty of water in them. It said there were several gallons in each of these pots. Essentially, there needed to be proof that, hey, this was water. There needed to be beyond reasonable doubt that this was a miracle. There should be no question. And we actually see this in our lives. We see this in the Old Testament. We see this in the New Testament, where God, he wants all the glory. So he's going to put you in a situation that seems there's nothing you could do. He does it with Abraham. Hey, I know your wife's barren. I know you're too old to have kids, but you're going to have kids. And sure enough, it happens. It needs to be known that it is a miracle of God. Same sort of thing in this instance. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew, hey, this is all water. And there's nothing that he could add to it that would change the contents. If he added anything, it would have just spilled out. Therefore, he couldn't be like, oh, hey, here's some extra wine, and it's like diluted bad wine, essentially. The amount of wine that Jesus made was significant, and he made sure that it was obviously a miracle. He turned something that was water into wine, something that it's not into something else, something entirely different. And you'll notice as we continue in John that he does this with all of his miracles. He wants to throw out any reasonable doubt to make sure you know, hey, this was all him 100%. Let's continue on in verse 8. And he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the head waiter. So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servant who had drawn the water knew. The head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. Take note of that. We'll talk about that in a second. This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. So once again, this is obviously a miracle. And notice what the conversation between the head waiter and the bridegroom. And he says, hey, most people, they drink, they get drunk, and that way they don't really care about the taste anymore, and so we give them the crappy wine, the stuff that's not as expensive and not as nice. But the head waiter says, hey, but you didn't do that. You saved the best for last. So Jesus took water and turned it in not just to good old-fashioned wine, oh yeah, it tastes nice, but the best of what they had. So this wasn't like just kind of like a cheap miracle where God's like, blue, 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 and then it changes to wine, and it's like, oh yeah, that tastes like wine. It's crappy wine, but it tastes like wine. No, it tasted good. They actually wanted it because of the way it tasted. Jesus gives in abundance, but just because he gives in abundance doesn't mean that we should revel in it. There are some people that may see this and say, oh, wow, God's given abundance of wine, therefore we should drink it till we get drunk. No, the Bible's very clear that we are not to get drunk on wine, period. There's no question of that. Now, there's argument whether or not you can have wine or not as a Christian. I will address that in a later video. We must be modest in the abundance that God blesses us. Now, the last thing that I want to hit on is, was the wine that Jesus made, was that really wine, or was it more like grape juice? And the second question that people tend to ask is, the word wine that Jesus used whenever he was turning the water into wine, wasn't that like a different Greek word? Let me just answer both of these questions. Number one, no. The word in Greek that is used in this context is a beverage that is fermented from grapes. So yes, it's alcohol. Sorry, guys, it's not a different Greek word. Okay, so on the second side of things, some people say, oh, wasn't it more like grape juice? Okay, I have a question. If it was just grape juice and there was no alcohol content, why would they say don't get drunk on it? There you go. we'll dive deeper into that in a few weeks whenever I give a video on alcohol and whether or not it's okay to drink or whether or not it's a sin. I hope you'll join with me next week when we continue in John chapter 2. Thanks.